My name is Carol, and I have a story that needs to be told. A story that lived in the shadows for far too long, hidden behind closed doors and silent tears. When you grow up with someone who is supposed to love you, your grandmother, the person who should protect you, it's hard to understand why they hurt you instead. I was just a child when the nightmare began, 5 years old, with pigtails and a smile that hadn't yet learned to hide pain. My parents were gone, lost to circumstances I was too young to understand. My grandmother Evelyn was all I had left in this world. She was supposed to be my safe harbor, my protector, the one who would kiss my scraped knees and chase away the monsters under my bed. Instead, she became the monster I couldn't escape from. The first time she hit me, I thought it was an accident. I had spilled my milk at breakfast, and her hand came down so fast, so hard across my face that I fell off my chair. The shock hurt more than the slap itself. I remember sitting on that cold kitchen floor, tasting blood in my mouth, wondering what I had done wrong. She stood over me, her face twisted with rage, and told me I was clumsy, worthless, that my parents left because they knew what a disappointment I would be. Those words cut deeper than any physical blow ever could. They burrowed into my young mind like parasites, eating away at whatever self-worth a 5-year-old could possess. Every day became a minefield. I learned to walk on eggshells, to anticipate her moods, to make myself small and invisible. But it was never enough. There was always something wrong. My hair wasn't brushed right. I walked too loudly. I breathed too much. I existed, and that seemed to be my greatest sin. The abuse escalated gradually, like a pot of water slowly coming to boil. What started as slaps became punches. What began as harsh words evolved into systematic destruction of my spirit. She would lock me in the basement for hours, sometimes overnight, with no food or water. The darkness down there was absolute, suffocating. I would curl up in the corner, trying to make myself disappear, praying to a God I wasn't sure was listening anymore. She was clever about it, my grandmother. She knew exactly where to hit so the bruises wouldn't show. She knew how to twist my arm just enough to cause agony without breaking bones. She knew how to smile at the neighbors and play the devoted grandmother, while behind our front door, she was systematically destroying a child's soul. School became my only escape, those precious hours where I could pretend to be normal. But even there, the shadow of her abuse followed me. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't make friends. How could I invite anyone over when I never knew what version of her they might meet? How could I explain why I flinched when teachers raised their hands to write on the board? The worst part wasn't the physical pain. Bodies heal, bruises fade. But the words she planted in my mind grew like poisonous vines, choking out any glimpse of hope or happiness. You're worthless. Nobody will ever love you. You deserve this. I should have let them take you away. You killed your parents with your existence. These became the soundtrack of my childhood, playing on repeat in my head, even when her mouth was closed. I tried to tell someone once. I was 8 years old, and my teacher noticed bruises on my arms. When she asked, I started to tell her the truth. But the words got stuck in my throat. My grandmother had warned me what would happen if I ever told. "They'll take you away," she said. "Put you in a home where things will be much worse. No one will believe you anyway. I'm all you have. Without me, you're nothing." So I lied. I told my teacher I fell off my bike. She looked at me with such concern, such kindness, that I almost broke down right there. But fear won. Fear always won. And that night, my grandmother punished me for almost telling. The beating was so severe I missed 3 days of school. When I went back, my teacher asked if I was okay. I smiled and said yes. I had become an expert at lying by then. Years passed in this terrible rhythm of violence and fear. By the time I was 10, I had stopped hoping for rescue. I accepted that this was my life, that I somehow deserved it. The happy child I might have been was buried so deep I couldn't even remember her face. In her place was a ghost, moving through life without really living, existing in a state of constant vigilance and dread. I survived on scraps of kindness from strangers. The lunch lady who always gave me extra food, somehow knowing I often went without dinner. The librarian who let me stay after school, pretending not to notice I was hiding from going home. These small acts of humanity kept a tiny flame alive inside me, though I didn't recognize it at the time. This is my story of survival against someone who should have been my greatest protector. It's a story of a child who endured the unthinkable and somehow found the strength to keep going. It's about the long journey from victim to survivor, from darkness to light, from silence to voice. Most importantly, it's a story of hope, because despite everything she did to break me, I'm still here. I survived, and now, finally, I'm ready to speak my truth. My grandmother Evelyn wasn't always a monster. Or maybe she was, and I was just too young to see it at first. When my parents died in that car accident, I was only 4 years old. The police officers who came to our house spoke in hushed whispers with the neighbors while I sat on the porch steps, clutching my stuffed rabbit, not understanding why Mommy and Daddy weren't coming home. Grandmother arrived the next day in her old blue sedan, wearing her church dress and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. She didn't hug me. She didn't cry. She just looked at me like I was a problem that needed solving, a mess that needed cleaning up. I remember reaching for her hand as we walked into what would become my prison, and how she pulled away like I was something dirty. The first few weeks were deceptively calm. She fed me, clothed me, enrolled me in school. To anyone looking from the outside, she was doing everything right. The grieving grandmother taking in her orphaned grandchild. People from church brought casseroles and praised her for her sacrifice. She would smile and pat my head in front of them, and I would lean into that touch, desperate for affection. But the moment they left, her hand would jerk away like she'd been burned. The transformation happened gradually. First, it was the rules, so many rules that my 5-year-old brain couldn't keep track of them all. No talking during meals, no toys outside of my room, no running in the house, no laughing too loud, no crying at all. Each infraction brought consequences, starting small but growing worse over time. I remember the first time I broke her favorite vase. It was an accident. I was reaching for a book on the shelf, and my elbow knocked it over. The crash seemed to echo forever in that silent house. She appeared in the doorway like a specter, her face darkening as she surveyed the broken pieces on the floor. I started to apologize, started to explain, but she grabbed my arm so hard I felt something pop. "You stupid, clumsy girl," she hissed. "That vase was worth more than you'll ever be. Do you know what you've done? Do you have any idea what you've cost me?" She made me pick up every shard with my bare hands. When I cut myself on the sharp edges, she told me it was good, that maybe pain would teach me to be more careful. I bled on her white carpet, and that earned me another punishment. No dinner for 3 days. Just water and stale bread, like I was a prisoner in my own home. But the physical punishments were almost easier to bear than the psychological warfare she waged daily. She had a gift for finding exactly the right words to destroy a child's spirit. She told me my parents died because they were driving to get away from me, that they saw what a burden I would become and chose death over raising me. She said I had my mother's weak chin and my father's stupid eyes, that I was the worst parts of both of them combined. She would play games with my mind. One day she'd tell me I could watch television after dinner if I was good. I'd spend all day being perfect, following every rule, holding my breath with hope. Then evening would come, and she'd look at me with mock surprise. "Television? I never said that. You must be making things up again. Liars don't get privileges in this house." These mind games made me question my own memory, my own reality. Was I really as bad as she said? Did I really forget things, make things up, cause all this trouble? By age 7, I had internalized her voice so completely that I could hear her criticisms even when she wasn't in the room. School should have been my refuge, but she made sure it wasn't. She told my teachers I was a troubled child, prone to lying and manipulation. She painted herself as the long-suffering grandmother, trying her best with a difficult grandchild. When I excelled at reading, she told them I was showing off. When I struggled with math, she told them I was lazy. She volunteered in my classroom once a week, ensuring I could never fully escape her watchful eye. The other children sensed something was wrong with me. I couldn't relate to their stories about family dinners and bedtime kisses. When they complained about their parents making them eat vegetables, I thought about the times my grandmother made me eat food from the garbage because I hadn't cleaned my plate fast enough. When they talked about birthday parties and presents, I remembered my 8th birthday, when she told me I was too old for such nonsense and spent the day listing all the ways I'd disappointed her that year. She was careful never to leave marks where others could see them. The bruises were always hidden under clothes. When she pulled my hair, it was from the underneath layers that wouldn't show. When she pinched me during church for fidgeting, it was on my inner arm where my sleeve would cover it. She was an artist of abuse, painting my body with pain in places only I would know about. The basement became her favorite punishment location. It was unfinished, with concrete floors and walls that seemed to sweat moisture. There were spiders down there, and mice that scratched in the walls. She would lock me down there for hours, sometimes from the moment I got home from school until bedtime. No light, no food, no bathroom, just the darkness and the sounds and the growing certainty that this was what I deserved. During those long hours in the basement, I would create elaborate fantasies. Sometimes I imagined my parents were still alive, that they would burst through the door and save me. Sometimes I pretended I was a princess locked in a tower, waiting for rescue. But as the years passed, even my imagination began to fail me. The darkness outside matched the darkness growing within. She broke my spirit systematically, methodically. Every small joy was stripped away. The books I loved were taken because I was enjoying them too much. The one friend I managed to make was driven away after my grandmother called her mother and told lies about me. The teacher who showed me kindness was transferred to another school after my grandmother complained to the principal about inappropriate attention. By age 10, I had learned to be invisible. I moved through that house like a ghost, making no sound, taking up as little space as possible. I had perfected the art of reading her moods, knowing from the way she breathed whether it would be a beating day or just a verbal assault day. I became hypervigilant, always watching, always ready to dodge or duck or disappear. But even perfection wasn't enough. She would find reasons to punish me. The way I folded towels, the expression on my face, the tone of my voice when I said yes, ma'am. Sometimes I think she punished me simply because she could, because hurting me had become as natural to her as breathing. The person who should have protected me became my greatest threat. The house that should have been my sanctuary became my torture chamber. The woman who shared my blood seemed determined to spill it. And through it all, I survived by making myself smaller and smaller, until I sometimes wondered if I would simply disappear altogether. Looking back now, I understand that her cruelty said nothing about my worth and everything about her own brokenness. But the child I was couldn't understand that. All I knew was that the person who was supposed to love me most in this world seemed to hate me with a passion I couldn't comprehend. And that knowledge carved wounds in my soul that would take decades to heal. The day everything changed, I was 11 years old. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November, and I had gotten my report card. Straight A's except for 1 B+ in physical education. I walked home slowly, the paper burning in my backpack, knowing that nothing less than perfection would be acceptable to her. I thought about changing the grade, but I knew she would find out. She always found out everything. When I showed her the report card, her face went through a transformation I'll never forget. First came the false calm, the tight smile that never reached her eyes. Then the coldness, like all the warmth had been sucked out of the room. Finally, the rage, building like a storm behind her gray eyes. She set the paper down on the kitchen table with deliberate care, smoothing out the corners. "A B+, she said, her voice deadly quiet, "in physical education. Do you know what this means, Carol? It means you're not just stupid, you're also weak. Pathetic. What college will want someone who can't even run properly? What job? What man would marry such a failure?" I tried to explain that I had asthma, that the teacher understood, that a B+ was still good. But she wasn't listening. She never listened. She stood up slowly, and I knew what was coming. I tried to run, but she was faster than her 60 years suggested. She grabbed my hair, yanking me backward so hard I saw stars. The first punch landed in my stomach. I doubled over, gasping, and she hit me again, this time in the ribs. I fell to the floor, curling into a ball, but she pulled me up by my shirt. "You think you can disappoint me? You think you can embarrass me in front of the whole town? Everyone will know I'm raising a failure." She dragged me to the basement door and threw me down the stairs. I tumbled down, my body hitting each step, until I landed in a heap on the concrete floor. Something in my wrist snapped. The pain was excruciating, but I bit my lip to keep from crying out. Crying only made things worse. She stood at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the kitchen light like some terrible angel of judgment. "You'll stay down there until you understand what you've done," she said. "And if I hear one sound, one whimper, you'll wish you had never been born." The door slammed shut, the lock clicked, and I was alone in the darkness with my broken wrist. I cradled it against my chest, feeling the bones grinding together with each movement, but I didn't make a sound. I had learned that silence was survival. Hours passed. The pain in my wrist faded to a dull throb, overshadowed by the gnawing hunger in my stomach and the pressure in my bladder. But I didn't move. I sat in that same spot where I had fallen, afraid that any sound might bring her back. When she finally let me out the next morning, my wrist was swollen to twice its normal size, purple and misshapen. She looked at it with disgust. "Now look what you've done to yourself," she said. "Clumsy girl, we'll tell the doctor you fell off your bike. And if you say any different, if you embarrass me in front of those medical professionals, you'll learn what real pain feels like." At the hospital, I repeated the lie perfectly. Fell off my bike, landed wrong, so clumsy. The doctor looked at me strangely, perhaps noticing the finger-shaped bruises on my arms or the way I flinched when my grandmother touched my shoulder. But he said nothing. They never said anything. The cast became a reminder of that day, but it was far from the last time she would break something in me. She discovered that physical violence was more effective than words at breaking my spirit. Where once she had relied on psychological torture, now she combined both into a symphony of abuse that left me reeling. She had favorite methods. The wooden spoon was for minor infractions, wrapped across my knuckles or the backs of my legs. The belt was for medium offenses, usually across my back where the welts wouldn't show. But for major disappointments, she used her hands. There was something personal about it, the way she would grab and shake and hit, like she was trying to physically beat the inadequacy out of me. Winter was the worst. She would lock me outside in the snow, wearing only my nightgown, watching from the window as I shivered and begged to be let in. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour, until my lips turned blue and I could no longer feel my feet. Then she would let me in and berate me for being too weak to handle a little cold. "Other children play in the snow for fun," she would say. "But you can't even stand it as punishment. Pathetic." She became creative with her punishments, making me kneel on rice until my knees bled, forcing me to hold heavy books with my arms outstretched until my muscles screamed and failed, making me write lines until my hand cramped and the words became illegible, then punishing me for sloppy handwriting. Each punishment was carefully crafted to cause maximum pain while leaving minimal evidence. The physical abuse changed me in ways the emotional abuse hadn't. I became jumpy, flinching at sudden movements or loud noises. I learned to gauge distances, always staying just out of arm's reach. I developed a sixth sense for her presence, knowing when she entered a room even with my back turned. My body was constantly tense, ready to dodge or run or curl into a protective ball. Sleep became elusive. Every creak of the house made me wonder if she was coming. Sometimes she would wake me in the middle of the night for imagined offenses. "Did you forget to wipe the kitchen counter? Did you leave a light on in the bathroom? Up, lazy girl. Time to learn your lesson." Those midnight beatings were the worst because I was disoriented, confused, unable to properly defend myself. I started hiding first aid supplies in my room, bandages stolen from the school nurse, ice packs made from frozen peas wrapped in old socks, pain medication pilfered from bathroom cabinets during rare visits to other homes. I became my own doctor, treating cuts and bruises and sprains with the expertise of someone twice my age. School became even more complicated. Gym class was torture when I had hidden injuries. I forged note after note excusing myself from physical activity. When teachers asked about my frequent absences, I became a master storyteller. Stomach flu, migraine headaches, family emergencies, anything but the truth. The other students started calling me Ghost Girl because I was so pale and thin and quiet. They didn't know that I was pale from spending so much time locked in the basement. They didn't know I was thin because food was withheld as punishment. They didn't know I was quiet because I had learned that words could trigger violence. One teacher, Mrs. Patterson, seemed to suspect something. She would keep me after class sometimes, asking gentle questions about home. Was everything okay? Did I need to talk to someone? Her kindness was almost unbearable. I wanted so badly to tell her everything, to collapse into her arms and beg for help. But my grandmother's threats echoed in my mind. No one will believe you. They'll think you're a liar, and when they send you back to me, you'll pay for your betrayal. So I smiled and lied and died a little more inside each day. The bruises healed and new ones took their place. The broken bones mended and she found new ways to cause pain. My body became a canvas of her rage, painted in purple and blue and yellow, a masterpiece of cruelty that no one else could see. By 13, I had stopped feeling pain the way normal people do. It was like my nerve endings had given up, overwhelmed by the constant assault. I could take a beating that would have hospitalized another child and barely react. This seemed to frustrate her, pushing her to find new ways to hurt me. But physical pain had become just another part of existence, like breathing or blinking. What hurt more was the loss of hope. Each beating drove home the message that this was my life, that I would never escape, that I would die in that house, either by her hand or my own. The physical abuse wasn't just about causing pain. It was about complete domination, about showing me that she owned every inch of my body and could do whatever she wanted with it. And through it all, she maintained her facade to the outside world, the devoted grandmother caring for her troubled grandchild. She never missed church, never forgot to smile at the neighbors, never let the mask slip in public. She was Jekyll and Hyde, and I was the only witness to the monster that emerged behind closed doors. The physical abuse taught me that my body wasn't really mine. It belonged to her rage, her frustration, her need to destroy something beautiful. Every scar told a story of survival, but also of loss. The loss of childhood, of safety, of the basic human right to exist without fear. And as the abuse escalated, I began to wonder how much more my body could take before it simply gave up entirely. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she saved my life without even knowing it. She transferred to our school in the middle of my freshman year, arriving with a confidence that seemed to light up the hallways. While other new students tried to blend in, Sarah walked like she belonged everywhere she went. She had this way of looking at people, really looking, like she could see past all the masks we wore. I first noticed her in English class. I was sitting in my usual spot in the back corner, the desk that let me see everyone while remaining invisible myself. She walked in, scanned the room, and chose the seat right next to me. Not in front of me, not behind me, but right beside me. No one ever sat next to Ghost Girl by choice. "Hi," she said, turning to face me with a smile that seemed genuine. "I'm Sarah. I like your notebook cover. Is that your artwork?" I looked down at the intricate patterns I had drawn during countless hours of trying to disappear into paper and ink. No one had ever noticed them before. No one had ever noticed me before, not in a good way. I managed to nod, and her smile grew wider. "It's beautiful," she said. "You're really talented. I'm terrible at drawing. My stick figures look like they're having seizures." I almost smiled. Almost. But then I remembered that connections were dangerous. People who got close to me became targets for my grandmother's paranoia. The last friend I'd tried to make in elementary school had been driven away after my grandmother called her parents and told them I was a bad influence, that I stole things, that I was disturbed. So I turned away from Sarah, pretending to focus on my textbook. But Sarah wasn't easily discouraged. Over the next few weeks, she kept choosing the seat next to me. She would make small talk before class, commenting on the weather or asking about assignments. She never pushed when I gave monosyllabic responses, but she never gave up either. It was like she had decided I was worth her persistence. One day, about a month after she arrived, I came to school with a particularly bad limp. My grandmother had pushed me down the stairs again the night before, and my ankle was swollen inside my shoe. I thought I was hiding it well, but Sarah noticed immediately. "You're hurt," she said quietly during class, while the teacher was writing on the board. "What happened?" "I fell," I said automatically. "Clumsy me." She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression made me think she didn't believe me. But she didn't push. Instead, she slipped me a note. "My mom's a nurse. If you ever need help with injuries, real help, let me know. No questions asked." I stared at that note like it was written in a foreign language. Help? No questions asked? These concepts were so alien to my experience that I couldn't process them. I folded the note carefully and tucked it into my notebook, where I would look at it dozens of times over the coming days, trying to decipher its meaning. Sarah began including me in small ways. She would share her snacks at lunch, saying her mom always packed too much. She would ask my opinion on things in class, drawing me into discussions despite my reluctance. She would walk with me between classes, chattering about her old school or her annoying younger brother, never seeming to mind that I rarely responded with more than a word or two. The day everything changed was a Thursday in March. It had been a particularly bad week at home. My grandmother had discovered that I had hidden a library book under my mattress, a fantasy novel about a girl who discovers she has magical powers. Reading for pleasure was forbidden, especially books that might give me ideas above my station. The punishment had been severe, leaving me with bruised ribs that made breathing painful. I was sitting outside during lunch, in my usual hidden spot behind the gym, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. Sarah appeared around the corner, not by accident, I realized later, but because she had been looking for me. She took one look at the way I was holding myself, the careful, shallow breaths I was taking, and her face changed. "That's not from falling," she said. "It wasn't a question. I should have lied, should have gotten up and walked away, should have protected myself and her from the truth. But something about the way she said it, without judgment, without pity, just simple acknowledgement, broke something loose inside me. "No," I whispered. "It's not." She sat down beside me, not too close, careful not to crowd me. "Can you tell me who?" And for the first time in my life, I told someone the truth. Not all of it, not the worst parts, but enough. I told her about my grandmother, about the rules and the punishments, about the basement and the beatings, about the fear that followed me everywhere, the certainty that this was my life forever. Sarah listened without interrupting, without gasping or looking horrified. She just listened, and when I finally ran out of words, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "My cousin went through something similar," she said finally, "with her stepfather. She thought she was alone too, thought no one would believe her, that it was her fault somehow. But it wasn't, and this isn't your fault either, Carol. None of it." I started crying then, silent tears that I had trained myself never to shed. Sarah didn't try to hug me or touch me, seeming to understand that comfort could feel like threat to someone like me. She just sat there, a steady presence, letting me know I wasn't alone. "We need to tell someone," she said gently. "A teacher, the counselor, someone who can help." Terror shot through me. "No," I said quickly. "You don't understand. She'll know. She'll make it worse. She said if I ever told, she'd—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "Okay," Sarah said. "Okay, we don't have to do anything today. But Carol, this isn't right. You know that, don't you? You don't deserve this." Those words hit me like a physical blow. You don't deserve this. No one had ever said that to me before. I had been told for so long that I deserved everything I got, that I was the problem, that I brought the punishment on myself. To hear someone say otherwise was like being told the sky was green or water flowed upward. It challenged everything I believed about myself. Sarah became my secret lifeline after that. She would check on me every day, noting new injuries with a practiced eye. She brought me first aid supplies, teaching me better ways to treat wounds. She snuck me food when she suspected I was being starved as punishment. Most importantly, she kept reminding me that what was happening wasn't normal, wasn't okay, wasn't my fault. She also began documenting things. She had a camera, an old digital one her parents had given her, and she started taking pictures of my bruises when I would let her. "Just in case," she said. "Evidence if we ever need it." The idea of evidence, of proof that this was really happening, was both terrifying and oddly validating. Through Sarah, I began to see that my experience wasn't unique. She told me about support groups, about other survivors, about people who had escaped situations like mine and built new lives. She gave me books to read, memoirs by abuse survivors who had found freedom and healing. I hid them carefully, reading them in stolen moments, finding pieces of myself in their stories. For the first time since my parents died, I had someone who saw me, really saw me, not as ghost girl or problem child or burden, but as a person worthy of care and concern. Sarah didn't try to fix me or save me. She just stood beside me, reminding me that I existed, that I mattered, that my pain was real and valid. She also helped me start planning. We researched emancipation laws and foster care and relatives I might have somewhere who could take me in. We looked into reporting procedures and what would happen after a report was made. It was all theoretical at first, just information gathering, but it planted seeds of possibility in my mind. Having Sarah in my life didn't make the abuse stop. If anything, my grandmother seemed to sense that something had changed, that I had found some small source of strength, and she tried even harder to break me. But now I had a reason to survive each beating, each humiliation. I had someone who was waiting for me, who would notice if I didn't show up, who would care if I disappeared. The moment I realized I wasn't alone was the moment everything changed. Not externally, not immediately, but internally. Something that had been dying inside me began to slowly come back to life. Hope, maybe, or just the simple knowledge that one person in this world thought I deserved better. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was the beginning of believing that maybe, just maybe, I could survive this after all. The decision to speak up didn't come suddenly. It built slowly, like pressure in a volcano, until keeping silent became more unbearable than the fear of what might happen if I told. Sarah had been my secret keeper for 6 months, and in that time, the abuse had escalated to levels that even I, accustomed to violence, found terrifying. It was a Wednesday morning in September when my grandmother finally went too far. She had been in a rage about something. I can't even remember what anymore. Maybe I had breathed too loudly. Maybe I had looked at her wrong. The reasons had become so arbitrary that they blurred together. What I do remember is the iron, the old heavy one she used for her church dresses. She heated it up, and I knew something terrible was coming. When she pressed it against my back, the pain was beyond anything I had experienced before. The smell of burning flesh filled the kitchen. I screamed, couldn't help it, and that made her angrier. She held it there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, then shoved me away. "Now you're marked," she said with satisfaction. "Branded like the worthless animal you are. Try explaining that away as clumsiness." I stumbled to school somehow, the burn hidden under my shirt, already blistering and weeping. The pain was excruciating with every movement, every breath. I made it to first period before Sarah saw me. She took one look at my face, at the way I was holding myself, and knew something was desperately wrong. She got me to the bathroom, helped me show her what had been done. I'll never forget the look on her face when she saw the burn. It was the first time I'd seen her truly shaken. The shape of the iron was perfectly imprinted on my skin, angry and red and undeniably intentional. "We're going to the nurse," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Right now. This ends today." I was too broken to argue. The pain had stripped away my ability to resist, to make excuses, to protect my grandmother's secrets. Sarah half carried me to the nurse's office, and once there, the words began pouring out of me like water through a broken dam. Nurse Williams was a kind woman who had always treated me gently during my frequent visits for mysterious injuries. When she saw the burn, her face went white. She called the principal immediately, and then the police, and then Child Protective Services. The machinery of intervention, so long held at bay by my silence, suddenly sprang into motion. I sat in that small office, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm September day, and told my story. First to the nurse, then to the principal, then to the police officer who arrived with kind eyes and a gentle voice. Each telling became easier, like a muscle remembering how to work after years of atrophy. The female detective who interviewed me was named Patricia Martinez. She had silver streaks in her dark hair and hands that moved carefully, like she was afraid of startling me. She listened to every word, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never pushing, never doubting. "Has this been documented before?" she asked gently. "Any hospital visits? Previous reports?" Sarah pulled out her phone, showing the dozens of photos she had taken over the months, dates, times, careful documentation of bruises and cuts, and the progression of injuries. Detective Martinez looked through them with professional calm, but I saw her jaw tighten with each swipe. "You're very brave," she told me. "Both of you. Sarah, this documentation is invaluable. And Carol, speaking up takes incredible courage. I want you to know that you're safe now. We're going to make sure of that." They took me to the hospital for a full examination. Every scar, every old break that had healed wrong, every sign of long-term abuse was catalogued and photographed. The doctor, a woman with gentle hands and sad eyes, found evidence of injuries going back years. The broken wrist that had never been properly set, the ribs that had been fractured multiple times, the malnutrition from systematic starvation. When they asked me to remove my shirt for photographs, I broke down completely, not from pain, but from shame. My body was a roadmap of my grandmother's rage, and having strangers see it, document it, acknowledge it as wrong, was overwhelming. But the medical staff was patient, professional, treating me with a dignity I had never experienced before. A social worker named Janet was assigned to my case. She was younger than my grandmother, with laugh lines around her eyes, and a voice that suggested she had seen too much, but still believed in happy endings. She explained what would happen next, the legal procedures, the temporary placement, the eventual court proceedings. "You won't have to go back there," she assured me. "Not ever. We have an emergency placement ready, a foster family experienced with situations like yours. They're good people. You'll be safe." The concept of safety was so foreign that I couldn't process it. For over a decade, danger had been my constant companion. The idea that I could go to sleep without fear, wake up without dread, exist without constant vigilance, seemed like a fairy tale too good to be true. They arrested my grandmother that same day. I wasn't there to see it, already placed in protective custody, but I heard about it later. She had apparently maintained her innocence, claimed I was a disturbed child making up stories for attention. But the evidence was overwhelming. The photographs, the medical examination, the burn in the perfect shape of an iron that couldn't possibly be explained away. That night, in a strange bed in a strange house with strange people who spoke softly and moved carefully around me, I lay awake thinking about my voice. For so many years, it had been silenced, trapped behind walls of fear and shame. But I had found it again, or maybe found it for the first time. And once unleashed, it had power I never imagined. The foster family was everything Janet had promised. The Johnsons had been taking in abused children for 20 years. They knew not to touch me without warning, not to raise their voices, not to make sudden movements. They had a protocol for everything, born from experience with dozens of broken children like me. Mrs. Johnson showed me to a room that would be mine. It had a lock on the inside, she pointed out, and I was the only one with a key. The window opened easily in case I needed to feel less trapped. There were books on the shelves, paper and pens in the desk drawer. Everything about it whispered safety and choice, concepts I was still learning to understand. Over the following days, as the legal system ground into motion, I had to tell my story again and again. To prosecutors, to court-appointed advocates, to therapists. Each telling hurt, but it also healed something. Speaking the truth out loud, having it believed and validated, began to chip away at the voice in my head that still whispered, I deserved it. Sarah visited every day after school, bringing homework and normalcy. She never treated me like a victim, never looked at me with pity. She was proud of me, she said, for finding my voice, for speaking up, for saving myself. Because that's what you did, she insisted. You saved yourself. I just reminded you that you were worth saving. The therapist they assigned me, Dr. Rebecca Chen, specialized in trauma recovery. She explained that finding my voice was just the first step in a long journey. There would be setbacks, she warned, Days when the old fears would resurface, when my grandmother's words would echo louder than the truth. But she also promised that it would get better, that voices grow stronger with use. In our sessions, she helped me understand that silence had been my survival mechanism, but it had also been my prison. By speaking up, I had broken those bars. The voice I had found wasn't just about telling what had been done to me. It was about reclaiming my narrative, my truth, my right to exist without fear. 2 weeks after I spoke up, I had to give a formal statement for the court proceedings. I sat in a small room with a video camera, Detective Martinez beside me, and told everything. Not just the recent abuse, but all of it, from the beginning. It took hours. I cried, had to take breaks, sometimes could barely get the words out. But I kept going, because my voice, so long silenced, finally had important things to say. When it was over, Detective Martinez turned off the camera and looked at me with something like awe. "In 20 years of doing this job," she said, "I've rarely seen such courage. Your voice is going to make sure she never hurts another child. You've done something incredible today." Finding my voice wasn't just about speaking up once. It was about learning that I had the right to speak, period. To say no, to ask for help, to express pain and fear and anger and hope, to tell my story on my own terms. It was about discovering that my voice had power, that my words mattered, that the truth, once spoken, could change everything. The day I walked out of the courthouse, knowing I would never have to see my grandmother again, the world looked different. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer, as if I had been living behind a dirty window that had finally been cleaned. The judge had terminated her parental rights and issued a permanent restraining order. She was going to prison for what she had done to me. I was free. But freedom, I quickly learned, was more complicated than simply being away from her. My body was free, yes, but my mind still lived in that house of horrors. I would wake up at 3 in the morning, certain I had heard her footsteps in the hall. I would flinch when Mrs. Johnson reached for the salt at dinner. I would hide food in my room, unable to believe it would always be available. The Johnsons were patient beyond measure. They had seen it all before, they told me. Other children who had to learn how to live without fear. Mr. Johnson would announce himself before entering a room where I was. Mrs. Johnson would narrate her movements while cooking, so I always knew where she was and what she was doing. They gave me space to be broken while gently showing me how to heal. My room became my sanctuary in a way my grandmother's house had never allowed. I could close the door whenever I wanted. I could read until dawn if I chose. I could eat snacks in bed, leave clothes on the floor, play music. These simple freedoms felt revolutionary. Sometimes I would do things just because I could, marveling at the absence of punishment. School was a different challenge. Everyone knew what had happened, or thought they did. Ghost Girl had become the girl who spoke up, and I wasn't sure which identity fit worse. Some kids treated me like I was made of glass. Others whispered behind their hands, spreading rumors that grew more elaborate with each telling. A few, the ones who recognized something familiar in my story, approached me quietly with their own truths. Sarah remained my constant. She never treated me differently, never acted like I was fragile or damaged. She celebrated my small victories, like the first time I laughed without immediately looking around in fear, or when I ate a full meal without anxiety. She helped me navigate the social complexities of being a survivor in a world that didn't know how to handle uncomfortable truths. Therapy with Dr. Chen became the framework for rebuilding myself. She introduced me to concepts I had never considered. That trauma lived in the body, not just the mind. That healing wasn't linear. That I would have good days and bad days, and that both were valid. That the negative voices in my head were my grandmother's, not mine, and I could learn to replace them. We worked on basic things that most people take for granted: how to accept compliments without immediately negating them, how to set boundaries, how to recognize that my needs mattered, how to exist in my body without constant hypervigilance. Each session felt like archaeology, carefully excavating the person I might have been beneath layers of abuse. The court case progressed slowly. There were depositions and hearings and meetings with lawyers. I had to see my grandmother once more during her trial. She sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller than I remembered, older. When our eyes met, I expected to feel the familiar terror. Instead, I felt something else. Pity, maybe, or just emptiness. She had no power over me anymore. Her lawyer tried to paint me as a troubled teen making up stories, but the evidence was insurmountable. The photographs, the medical records, the testimony from teachers who had suspected but never acted. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, I didn't feel joy or vindication, just relief. It was over. Building a new life was like learning to walk again. Every day brought new challenges. The first time I got a B on a test and didn't panic. The first time I made a mistake and wasn't punished. The first time I said no to something and the world didn't end. Each small moment was a victory against years of programming. The Johnsons helped me apply for a part-time job at the local library. The manager, Ms. Rodriguez, knew my story and hired me anyway, or perhaps because of it. She said she believed in second chances, though I pointed out this was really my first chance. The job gave me purpose, structure, and most importantly, my own money. Financial independence, even in small amounts, felt like power. I discovered I loved books even more when I could read them freely. I devoured stories of survival and triumph, memoirs by people who had overcome odds worse than mine. I read psychology texts, trying to understand what had made my grandmother the way she was. Not to excuse her, but to assure myself that I wouldn't become her. There were setbacks, panic attacks in crowded spaces, nightmares that left me shaking. Days when getting out of bed felt impossible. Times when I could hear her voice so clearly it was like she was in the room. But there were also breakthrough moments. The first time I felt safe enough to sleep through the night. The first time I made a decision without second-guessing myself. The first time I looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim. College planning became a goal that seemed simultaneously impossible and necessary. My grades had always been good, my desperate attempt to be perfect enough to avoid punishment. Now they became a ticket to a future I was only beginning to imagine. Mrs. Johnson helped me with applications, and the guidance counselor worked to get fee waivers and scholarship information. When the acceptance letters started arriving, I couldn't believe they were real. Universities wanted me. They saw potential in me. The girl who had been told she was worthless, stupid, a burden, was being offered opportunities to learn and grow and become something more. I chose a school 3 states away, far enough to feel like a fresh start. The Johnsons threw me a graduation party. It was small, just them and Sarah and a few other friends I had slowly made. But it was mine, my achievement, my celebration, my moment. When Mr. Johnson hugged me and said he was proud, I believed him. When Mrs. Johnson cried and called me their success story, I let myself feel worthy of it. Packing for college was surreal. I had possessions now, things that were mine, clothes that fit, books I had chosen. The girl who had once owned nothing but fear now had a laptop, a phone, a future. Each item I packed felt like a small rebellion against everything my grandmother had tried to beat into me. Sarah and I promised to stay in touch. She had been my lifeline, my witness, my first real friend. Without her, I might never have found the courage to speak up. She was going to art school, planning to use her talent for seeing people to create beauty in the world. We were both survivors in our own ways, bound by a friendship forged in the darkest of circumstances. The night before I left for college, I sat in my room at the Johnsons' house, thinking about the journey from that basement to this moment. Breaking free hadn't been a single act of escape. It had been 1,000 small steps, each one taking me further from the prison of abuse and closer to the person I was meant to be. Freedom, I had learned, wasn't just the absence of abuse. It was the presence of choice, the ability to make decisions, to make mistakes, to be imperfect without fear. It was knowing that I had a voice and the right to use it. It was understanding that I deserved love and respect and opportunity. It was believing that my future didn't have to be defined by my past. As I closed my suitcase, ready for the next chapter of my life, I thought about the girl I had been. Scared, silenced, sure she would die in that house. I wished I could tell her that she would survive, that she would escape, that she would learn to live and laugh and love, that breaking free was possible, even when it seemed like the chains were unbreakable. That freedom, once tasted, would be worth every difficult step it took to achieve it. 25 years have passed since I walked out of that courthouse a free person. 25 years of building a life that my grandmother tried to convince me I didn't deserve. As I sit in my garden, watching my own grandchildren play, I sometimes can't believe how far I've come from that terrified girl in the basement. College was where I truly began to understand what reclaiming my power meant. Away from everyone who knew my story, I could reinvent myself. Not by hiding my past, but by refusing to let it define my entire identity. I was a survivor, yes, but I was also a student, a friend, a young woman discovering who she could be when fear wasn't driving every decision. I studied psychology, driven by a need to understand trauma and healing. Every class felt personal, every textbook a mirror reflecting parts of my experience. But it also gave me distance, a clinical framework to understand that what happened to me wasn't unique or deserved. It was part of a larger pattern of abuse that had nothing to do with my worth and everything to do with my grandmother's sickness. In my junior year, I met David. He was patient and kind, with a laugh that made me feel safe. When I eventually told him about my past, he listened without flinching, held space for my pain without trying to fix it. He understood that some scars don't fade, that healing isn't about forgetting, but about learning to carry the weight differently. Our relationship taught me new lessons about power, that it could be shared, not hoarded, that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but strength, that love didn't require perfection or payment. When he proposed, I said yes, not because I needed him to save me, but because I wanted to build a life with someone who saw me as whole, not broken. The decision to have children was the hardest I ever made. The fear that I might somehow repeat the cycle, that my grandmother's poison might flow through my veins to the next generation, kept me awake at night. But therapy helped me understand that awareness was my greatest protection, that I could choose differently, that love could be learned even by those who hadn't received it. When I held my daughter for the first time, something ancient and wounded inside me finally began to heal. Looking at her perfect face, I understood viscerally what had been stolen from me. The innocence, the trust, the unconditional love every child deserves. But I also understood that I could give her what I never had. I could break the chain. Parenting triggered unexpected trauma responses. The first time my toddler son spilled his milk, I froze, waiting for rage that never came. When my daughter colored on the walls, I had to leave the room to remind myself that children make messes, that mistakes don't warrant punishment, that discipline and abuse are not the same thing. David was my anchor during those moments. He would gently remind me that I wasn't her, that our home was safe, that our children would never know the fear I had lived with. Together, we created a household built on respect and boundaries and communication, where voices could be raised in laughter, not just anger, where mistakes were learning opportunities, not crimes. I went back to school when my children were older, earning my doctorate in clinical psychology. My dissertation focused on breaking cycles of intergenerational trauma. Every interview I conducted, every data point I analyzed, reinforced what I had learned in my own journey. That healing was possible, that cycles could be broken, that power could be reclaimed. My practice specialized in treating abuse survivors. In every client I saw echoes of my younger self, the hypervigilance, the self-blame, the disbelief that they deserved better. I became the therapist I had needed, someone who truly understood the weight of carrying someone else's sickness as your own shame. The day I received a letter from the prison saying my grandmother had died, I felt nothing at first. Then came a flood of emotions I couldn't name, not grief exactly, but something like it. Grief for the grandmother she should have been, perhaps, or grief for the child who had loved her before learning that love could be a weapon. I chose not to attend her funeral. Some called it unforgiving, but forgiveness isn't owed to those who never sought it. My power lay in choosing how to honor my own healing over social expectations. I spent that day with my family instead, surrounded by the love I had built despite her efforts to convince me I was unworthy of it. My children grew up knowing my story in age-appropriate ways. They understood that Grandma Carol had survived something difficult, that some people hurt others, but that strength could grow from pain. When my daughter faced her own challenges, she would say, "If you could survive all that, Mom, I can handle this." My story became not a burden for them, but a source of inspiration. Professional success came steadily. Books published, conferences spoken at, lives touched and changed. Each accomplishment felt like a small victory against the voice in my head that sometimes still whispered worthless. But more than the accolades, it was the quiet moments that showed me how far I had come. Reading bedtime stories without fear, laughing freely at dinner, existing in my body without apology. The garden became my meditation space, planting seeds, nurturing growth, watching life flourish under gentle care. Everything my grandmother had tried to kill in me bloomed in that soil. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but healing rarely is. Sometimes we need tangible reminders that beauty can grow from damage. When Sarah got married, I was her maid of honor. In my speech, I talked about the friend who had seen past my shadows to the person struggling to emerge, who had believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself, who had shown me that connection was possible even when trust felt impossible. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, but they were tears of joy, not pain. Becoming a grandmother myself was the ultimate reclamation. When my daughter placed my granddaughter in my arms, I whispered promises to her, that she would always be safe with me, that my hands would only offer comfort, that she would know nothing but love from this grandmother, and I meant every word. Now I watch my grandchildren play with the freedom I never had. They run without looking over their shoulders. They laugh without fear of punishment. They make mistakes and are met with patience and teaching, not violence. They trust without question that the adults in their lives will protect them. This is my greatest victory. Sometimes young survivors reach out, having read my books or heard my story. They ask how I did it, how I broke free, how I healed. I tell them the truth, that it wasn't easy or quick, that healing isn't a destination but a journey, that some days are still hard, but that reclaiming your power is possible, one choice at a time. I think about power differently now than I did as that terrified child. Then power meant control through fear, the ability to hurt without consequence. Now I know real power is gentleness in the face of harshness. It's choosing love when you were taught hate. It's speaking truth when silence feels safer. It's building something beautiful from the ashes of destruction. My grandmother tried to break me, and in many ways she succeeded. The girl I might have been without trauma died in that house. But from those broken pieces, I built someone stronger, someone who knows that survival is its own form of resistance, that choosing joy after being taught only pain is the ultimate rebellion. This is what reclaiming power looks like. Not a dramatic movie moment of confrontation, but 1,000 quiet choices to be different, to parent with patience, to love without conditions, to trust despite betrayal, to speak when silence would be easier, to help others find their own voices, to live fully despite someone's efforts to diminish you. My story began with a little girl who thought she deserved abuse because that's all she had ever known. It continues with a woman who knows her worth, who has built a life of purpose and love and meaning. The scars remain, will always remain, but they no longer define me. They're simply part of my history, proof that I survived, evidence that I refused to let cruelty have the final word. To anyone still trapped in their own basement, literal or metaphorical, know this. Your story isn't over. Your voice matters. Your pain is valid. And your power, though it might feel lost forever, is waiting to be reclaimed. It lives in every breath you take despite someone's efforts to suffocate you. In every morning you choose to keep going. In every moment you dare to hope for something better. I am Carol. I am a survivor. I am a mother, a grandmother, a healer, a voice for the voiceless. I am proof that the human spirit can endure cruelty and still choose kindness. That power taken can be reclaimed. That broken doesn't mean worthless. That the end of innocence can be the beginning of strength. My grandmother's legacy was meant to be destruction. Instead, it became transformation. Not because of what she did, but because of what I chose to do with it. This is my power. This is my victory. This is my life, reclaimed and rebuilt and beautiful despite the darkness it grew from, and it is mine.